Well, we go to New York now. You saw, of course, Sherwin Bryce-Pease on that piece in the break just before we saw that piece. As you heard, International Relations Minister Lindiwe Sisulu is expected to launch that bid for a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And Sherwin, as we speak to you this evening, I suppose the first question I must ask you is, how successful is Pretoria's bid going to be this time around?
Well, the first thing that I need to say, Bongani, is welcome to the SABC family. To answer your question, there is great optimism that South Africa will, of course, succeed in the non-permanent elections due in June here in New York. I was looking back at the record. This is the third time South Africa will be running for a non-permanent seat. In the first term in the Mbeki administration, they managed to garner 181 votes out of a then 192 member General Assembly. In the second bid, they managed to get 182 votes. So really, I think the goal for South Africa on this third bid will be to get at least 183. They certainly want to do better in terms of the voting record for that seat, the endorsement from the international community for that seat. But of course, those numbers will only be available when they vote in June.
Well, what are the chances? I mean, is there still a great deal of goodwill towards South Africa? If you think, of course, about the controversies during the last term in the Council in 2011 and 2012, when it voted to create that no-fly zone in Libya that eventually led to the ousting and the death of Muammar Gaddafi.
Well, if you remember, even before the second term, there was the first term where South Africa played a very significant role in the lack of action against over human rights concerns in places like Zimbabwe and in Burma. Of course, that was a very controversial first term in that regard. Essentially, the Mbeki administration then arguing that was the domain of the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Then, of course, as you mentioned, Resolution 1973 in 2011, a very controversial vote, both in South Africa, particularly from opposition parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters, but also from fellow African states. You'll remember a fierce criticism from then President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, very unhappy that South Africa voted, in essence, in his view, for regime change in Libya. But of course, the South African argument at that time, under the Zuma administration, was that they were voting for the no-fly zone so that they could protect civilians. And in their view, the NATO campaign that then followed that vote went too far. Essentially, you saw Muammar Gaddafi being pulled out of a foxhole and then, of course, assassinated. And they felt that they needed to put pressure on the Mugabe regime to bring him to the negotiation table so that a ceasefire could then be instituted. And then what was then an African Union panel, which included President Zuma, would go in and negotiate sort of a path out for Muammar Gaddafi. That, of course, didn't happen. Many African countries, many opposition parties in South Africa, very unhappy that perhaps South Africa didn't have the broad understanding of what the term, there was a line in that resolution, Bongani, that talked about protecting civilians by all means necessary. And all means necessary essentially meant this extended bombing campaign led by NATO that has led to the types of chaotic scenes that you saw with the African slaves most recently in Libya, and just the very unraveling of that society that the United Nations and certainly the international community is struggling now to put back together.
Sherwin, as conflicts rage around the world, we're often presented with this east-west divide that often leads to stalemates, particularly, of course, between Russia and the United States. Do we know which way South Africa is likely to lean in those positions when things are split right down the middle?
Well, I think it's an answer, Bongani, that requires reading the tea leaves. I mean, what's our sense based on the allegiances that South Africa has firmed up certainly in the last decade? And what we've seen is certainly a strong relationship, that is epitomized by the BRICS grouping, stronger relations, closer ties between Russia and South Africa, between China and South Africa, and some friction, one could argue, between Washington and Pretoria, just given the the long-standing issues of some of the allegiances that America sought when the ANC was fighting for liberation in South Africa. So it's nothing that I can affirm to say South Africa is going to side with this one. They will come here in the spirit of wanting to work with everybody. This, of course, is the centenary year of the birth of Nelson Mandela. There is going to be a peace summit called the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit that is going to be held just before the heads of state segment of the high-level meeting of the General Assembly in September. So from that position, they will say that they will be really wanting to infuse this body, a body that is now being described as controversial, lacking the ability to really resolve conflicts around the world, and really infuse it with some of the ideals perhaps that former President Nelson Mandela best represents.
There was a sense during President Zuma's tenure that South Africa had perhaps moved away in terms of playing an active role on the international stage. Do you have a sense that now there's going to be an opportunity for more influence, where they might even be able to be deal breakers in some of the issues that we see around the Council? What are we bringing to the table?
Well, South Africa has consistently over the years, Bongani, argued that it places human rights at the center of its foreign policy. There are many groups and countries around the world, particularly in the West, that might disagree with that, particularly given their stance on issues as it relates to Zimbabwe. There have been concerns about South Africa's position on Myanmar. There have been concerns about, its efficacy in terms of human rights throughout the African continent, the intractable nature now of South Sudan's conflict. You see the unraveling in the Democratic Republic of Congo, despite a great deal of international investment, particularly from countries like South Africa that to this day have a large contingent supporting the MONUSCO peacekeeping force in the DRC. There is, though, a concern that South Africa has perhaps at times wavered. It has moved away from the central tenet of its foreign policy, which essentially is human rights. And there's a good example. Most recently, there was a vote in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and South Africa getting a lot of criticism for abstaining in a vote that would have allowed an already existing commission of inquiry into Syria to specifically investigate what is going on in the enclave of Eastern Ghouta, which is very much a central focus of the Security Council right now in terms of this 30-day resolution ceasefire that it's trying to institute. And South Africa abstained on the vote, of course, arguing later that they didn't have enough time to consult with the capital before this vote was brought up by the United Kingdom, but abstaining on a vote that essentially would have looked at the atrocities being perpetrated in Eastern Ghouta. So it is perhaps the lack of consistency or the lack of clarity from the South Africans that is most concerning to the international community. President Cyril Ramaphosa was on a UN panel a few years ago that codified the term the responsibility to protect, which really is a fundamental tenet here of how countries have a responsibility to stop mass atrocities around the world. He was part of a panel that coined that. So there is, I think, a lot of hope that he will perhaps bring that kind of sentiment, that kind of resolute resolve back to South Africa's position, certainly here at the UN Security Council.
Well, that was our UN correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York.